Hello, my name is Andrew. You can call me Cookies, and today we'll be taking a look at healer stat weights, talking about the benefits and the downsides to each of the different stats for all of the different healing specs. But before we get started, I just wanted to point out my Patreon that you guys can support. I don't monetize any of my YouTube content whatsoever, and I don't plan to. So the way that I get support is through things like Patreon and streaming on Twitch. So if you guys want to check out the Patreon, basically it just has a lot of unique benefits. So if you support, you get something in return, typically. So like, I'll do log and VOD reviews. A lot of the log and VOD reviews I upload on my channel are people who have gone through Patreon with me and done that stuff. Otherwise, just feel free to, if you can, support. It means a lot. It helps the channel grow. And the more support I get on Patreon, the more quality content I can release and the more time I can put into all this stuff. So thank you so much, and enjoy the video. Okay, so stat weights for Holy Paladin. Starting with haste, we basically have, this is going to be our best overall stat. Pretty much want as much of this as possible. There are diminishing returns once you get like above somewhere around like 25%. I don't know the exact percentages or anything like that, but basically the way that I see it is think of haste as a shorter GCD. It makes your abilities feel better. It makes your class feel better. It scales really well with Paladin cooldowns because you have stuff like Wings, you have Holy Avenger if you're playing Venthyr, you have Ashen Hollow, stuff like this where like let's take Wings for example because that's universal across all the different covenants and everything. So Wings is, it's a duration spell, so it lasts for 20 seconds. And in that 20 seconds, you want to try to fit as many Paladin spells as possible because the more spells you can fit inside of your Wings, the more damage and healing that Wings provided. Because Wings itself doesn't contribute any healing, it just buffs the rest of your spells. So that's what makes Haste really powerful, stuff like that. It also is just the single best way to increase Ashen damage and healing if you're running Venthyr. And yeah, so my advice for this is typically go anywhere between 25 to 30% haste, and then you can start thinking about other stats to incorporate. Otherwise, you should just be kind of always taking whatever has the most haste, or taking item level. As long as your haste stays above like 20%, you're pretty much good. Okay, next we have versatility that we'll go over. So versatility is a good increase to healing and damage, but it's not the best for either. It's not the best stat to go for if all you want is damage, and it's not the best stat to go for if all you want to do is more healing. The added benefit that it also has is that it gives you extra survivability, especially for harder content. That's why this stat is typically taken as like the second best stat for Holy Paladin. So you'll see like some of my stuff is starting to have versatility enchants and gems on it. That's because as I get closer to 25% haste, I'm going to start leaning in more towards taking versatility. This is more geared towards M+. If I was doing raiding, I'd probably choose one of the following stats. So critical strike, it's a good all-around stat. Historically, it's always been good for Holy Paladin because you want your Holy Shock to crit to get Infusion of Light, but that's not really the case anymore because we don't really use Infusion of Light that often. The Holy Light proc's okay, but typically the best way to think about crit is it's your best raw increase to damage. So if you take crit, it's going to be the stat that's giving you the most amount of damage increase into your build. And then mastery is the exact opposite. It is the best raw increase to your healing done. So if all you want to accomplish is I want to do as much damage as possible on my Holy Paladin, I don't care about survivability or healing, then you would just get 25 to 30% haste and then just get as much crit as possible. That's if you want to do the most amount of damage possible. If it's I want to do as much healing as I possibly can and I don't care how high my damage is, I don't care how much damage I'm contributing to a raid or a M+ encounter or anything like that, then what you would do is you get 25 to 30% haste and then you would move over into mastery. What does mastery do exactly? It basically just increases your healing done by a flat percentage, and it is based on proximity to your target, so that's like the distance between you and the person you're healing. You get more of a benefit if they're closer, so mastery scales better in like closer encounters where the raid's stacked up, or in Mythic Plus where you're kind of always in melee with your your group and it's more close quarters. But either way, even if the raid's spread out, mastery is still typically going to be your best stat to increase your healing. And that's the best way to think about it for Holy Paladins, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next healer. Okay, so next up we have Resto Shaman. First off, we'll start with Critical Strike, typically regarded as the best stat for Resto Shaman. It's the best raw increase to your healing done, and it also is a direct source for more mana regen. So in raid content specifically, if you feel like you're running out of mana before the fight's over and you're using stuff like Mana Potion, you definitely just want to build more crit because it will naturally help with your mana regen. There's also a lot of other reasons why you could be running out of mana, but that's a totally different topic. But think of crit as really, really solid increase to your healing, probably the best increase to your overall healing done, and then also you get mana regen out of it. Next up, we have versatility. This is a good all-around stat for a mix of increasing your damage and your healing. So typically in a raid environment, this is taken second. So it's like crit, verse, and we're still going in order. So versatility is a nice balance, but in the context of what's the best healing stat after crit, it's typically going to be versatility, but it's kind of dependent on things. So then we have haste. This just makes your GCDs a little bit shorter, and it helps the class feel faster and more fluid as you're playing it. And it's also, haste is a really good stat to increase your damage done. So that's why in Mythic Plus you'll see people build like haste and versatility a lot rather than crit and versatility, because they want to increase their damage as much as possible. So it goes, okay, so haste increases my damage the most, and then I'm going to get versatility also, because that's the other stat that increases my damage. Crit, not very good for damage, because a lot of your spells auto-crit as far as damage spells go. And then you have Mastery, which we'll talk about, and that is a good overall stat for healing done, but it has limited value due to the way that it works. The way that it works is that you basically do increased healing to targets that are... depending on the target's health. So like the lower HP someone is, the more your mastery will heal them for. So this can be really good in like raid progression and even Mythic Plus and stuff like that. But if you build too much of it, it's going to get to the point to where you're just overhealing people, or you're not getting enough value out of it because people aren't that low HP all the time. So the best way to think about mastery, I think what people normally do, again, I'm not like a big theory crafter on all this stuff. I typically just take whatever's the highest eye level and call it good. But as far as mastery goes, I think like 60% is the sweet spot where you want to be at typically in raid. Like in raid content, if you're progression raiding and stuff, you want to be at about 60% mastery. And then for Mythic Plus, it's kind of the same thing. If you feel like you're struggling with healing and you want more tank healing or more group healing, then probably about 60% mastery. Otherwise, just lean into the other damage-based stats like haste and verse. And just to be clear with haste, it's typically not a stat that's really looked at that much for raid, but it is still good. I like running about, if I had to pick like a random number, if I have any lower than like 10% haste on my Resto Shaman, it feels pretty awful even in raid. So, but I've also seen people who play with like less than 5% haste, and they just literally don't care about the stat at all. Haste is one of those stats where it's like, you have to kind of feel it out and feel like, does it feel good to press your buttons? Does the class feel fluid enough for you? Do you want to cast, do you want your things to cast a little bit faster? Do you want to be like pressing buttons a little bit more? Do you want to be a little more flexible? Or do you not mind the kind of long wait time between each spell as you're kind of planning out what you're doing and just doing big healing that way? So that's more of like a feel thing. So just to recap, crit, best raw increase to healing. You also get mana regen. Versatility, best of both worlds. You get some damage, some healing, get a bit of survivability. Haste just makes the class feel better, so feel it out yourself. Mastery, good stat for healing, but don't take too much of it, otherwise you're kind of overkilling the whole point of the mastery. So we got Resto Druid next. Starting off with haste. This is just flat out the best increase to just about everything the Druid provides. Damage, it increases your dot damage because of how fast your dots tick. It increases your healing because you have so many hots and various things that scale off of haste. So just haste for druids is like the best stat. And then as you get into like that, we kind of talked about with Holy Paladin earlier, as you get into that like diminishing value, diminishing return area of like 25 to 30% haste, that's when you can start thinking about the other stats and like worrying about them and considering them. But until then, you should really just be honed in on as much haste as possible on your gear, pretty much, as a Resto Druid. And that goes for M plus and raid. And then this is where things start like kind of diverting a lot, and you have a lot of different options with the other secondary stats. So crit is going to be typically your next best raid healing stat, and also your best Mythic Plus damage stat. So it's going to increase your damage the most in like a Mythic Plus setting, and it's going to increase your healing the most in a raid setting. But it's not true for the other. So like for instance, it's not going to increase your healing the most in Mythic Plus because of the way certain things work. So that's where we move into our next stat, which is Mastery. Mastery is your best Mythic Plus healing stat, and it's like a niche situational good raid healing stat. So the way that this is good is because our Mastery, what it does is our healing is increased for each active hot that we have on the target. So for every hot I have on someone I'm healing, any spell, it increases that by, X% depending on my mastery. It's basically whatever your mastery percentage is. So the reason this is good in M plus and not in raid typically is because in M plus you have a lot less targets to heal, so you can have a lot more hots active on each target. But in a raid, most people in the raid aren't going to have more than like 2 hots on them at a time. It's very unlikely. You're more than likely only going to have 1 hot on somebody at a time in a raid setting, because it's just there's so many people in the group, especially if you're doing like heroic with more than 20. But even on mythic with 20 players exactly, like your healing is just spread more and more thin as the the size of the group increases. But it can also be, mastery can be a very potent stat in raid in certain situations. So the certain situation is when you're running a specific build. It's like the photosynthesis build. It's where you take spring blossoms in raid. You have photosynthesis. You don't have to have photosynthesis, but it helps a lot. And then you're running also like cultivation. Like you're running all these things that add extra hots to the group. And then the specific scenario is that the raid is like fully stacked on top of each other at all times. Where I could see this potentially being good is something like Soul Render. Or, I'm sorry, I always get the bosses confused. Not Soul Render, we're talking about Painsmith. So Heroic and Mythic Painsmith, where you have an efflorescence down, the whole raid is standing in it. You're putting rejuves out on everybody. There's people dipping below 50% health very regularly, so they get the extra hot from cultivation. That's where mastery becomes a really good raid healing stat, is when you can apply a lot of hots to a cluster of players that are all stacked up and get good value out of that mastery. And then lastly, we have versatility, which is a very, very low healing increase compared to our other stats. Sorry, my off. But it's a okay damage stat. So versatility, not the greatest stat ever. Increases some survivability. It's okay for damage, so it's good in M plus, but typically you can find better stats elsewhere. So again, just to go over them one more time, haste is going to be your best increase to just about everything. You want a lot of haste. Crit is going to be your best raid healing stat. Typically, this isn't always the case, but again, we're kind of just covering the basics. So crit is your best raid healing stat, and also it does the most damage in M plus. And then you have mastery, which is going to be the most increase to healing in Mythic Plus. So if you feel like you need more healing in M plus and you want to keep your group safe, get a lot of mastery. And it's not the same in raid. It's kind of niche, and if you just want as much healing as you can do in raid, get a lot of crit. And then you have versatility, which is kind of just like if you have it, cool, but it's not really that desirable of a stat. So yeah, that covers Druid. Okay, so we'll go over Holy Priest, which typically it's really dependent on the build, but I think most people are running Flash Concentration still. So with Flash Concentration, haste is going to be your best stat. And this is also, even with or without Flash Concentration in M plus content, haste is pretty much always going to be your go-to stat as Holy. Next you have crit, which is kind of the best damage and healing stat for Holy Priest. So you'll see that a lot in M plus. You'll see haste crit. And then in raid also, haste crit's really good. Mastery is the old traditional thing. So if you see Flash Concentration not being used, there's some people who use the other legendary, the Harmonious Apparatus. I don't remember what it's called exactly, but it's the other legendary that people run. Basically, if you're not running Flash Concentration, then crit and mastery become your best healing stats. Haste is just if you're running flash concentration and doing like that kind of spammy single target build. So you have crit and mastery, kind of just think of them as both really, really solid healing stats if you're not using flash concentration. If you are, they both kind of are beneficial. Crit has the added benefit of being, increasing your healing and damage rather than mastery only increasing your healing. And then lastly, you have versatility, which is an okay stat, gives a bit of everything, but it's typically kind of underwhelming for Holy Priest. But it can be good in like progression content if you need a little bit of extra survivability, since Priest obviously struggles with that quite a bit. So next we'll move over to Disc. I'll just switch specs while I do that. Haste is going to be your best stat, typically until you're above 21% haste. Doesn't have to be too specific. I think there is one specific number. I'm pretty sure it's 21% that you want to reach because that lets you get in an extra atonement during your ramp. I think there might be another breakpoint, but again, I'm not a big theory crafter, so I don't know all of the stuff off the top of my head. But typically try to go above like 20% haste, and then from that point, it's kind of just a game of like seeing how it feels and seeing what you personally, how you personally like the haste levels. Next, you have crit, which is going to be your typically best healing and damage increase for if you're running evangelism. It's always the best damage increase, but healing increase wise, it's best if you're running evangelism. It's still good for Spirit Shell, but mastery, we're going to go over now, is the best healing increase for Spirit Shell because of the way mastery works. Here it is. It increases the amount absorbed and healed through your atonements, so that makes Spirit Shell even stronger. But the negative is that there's 0 damage gain associated with mastery, so that's why even with Spirit Shell, you'll typically see a lot of people just running the kind of haste crit stat weights. But again, if you want bigger Spirit Shells or you feel like you're not healing enough in raid, consider grabbing some mastery if you're running Spirit Shell. But that's where things differ, is like if you're swapping back and forth between evangelism and Spirit Shell depending on the fight, a lot of people kind of are right now, then you should just go more towards haste and crit because crit's better for evangelism. So if you're running mastery with evangelism, it's not like the worst thing ever, but it's definitely not as good as crit. And then you have versatility, which same as Holy Priest, is an okay stat to increase healing, damage, survivability, all that stuff, but it's not really a standout stat by any means compared to the others. So that covers Priest, I believe. All right, and lastly, let's talk about the Mistweaver Monk. So crit is going to be your best healing stat, just flat out. It helps increase the amount of healing that you're doing with all of your spells. And spells, when they do crit, are really, really potent because you have a lot of spells that cleave or do some form of, like rapid healing, like you have Refreshing Jade Wind, where it just is healing like constantly as you're standing there. Like this is constantly emanate healing. You can see up here at the top left, this is like each cast that it's doing basically. So all of those having a chance to crit is really nice, and they all like individually do it rather than the entire spell itself. So crit just has a lot of value because it's going to be proccing so often and stuff. And then versatility is your next best healing stat for raid content, and that's because it just scales really well with a lot of the Mistweaver spells. Especially, I'm not like a huge theory crafting person or anything, so other people might be able to elaborate better. But like Essence Font is supposedly like it scales really, really heavily with versatility for some reason. So the more versatility you have, the more powerful your Essence Fonts are. You'll see some, I remember back in Eternal Palace, back in BFA, people had these like crazy high amounts of versatility, and Essence Font would actually just like basically lay on hands the entire raid if you channeled it into the raid. And then we have Haste, which just helps your GCDs feel better. Like with most healers, it's just going to help the class feel a little bit more fluid. So that's just another stat where it's kind of like, see it for yourself. If you feel like the class is clunky or you feel like certain things aren't happening like they're supposed to be, then you probably want a little bit more haste. And if it feels to the point where you're going too fast or you're not doing enough healing or you're not doing enough output in some way, then that's where you take some haste away. And then lastly, we have Mastery, which is, it's the best stat for single target healing and direct healing. So this would be really good in stuff like Mythic Plus if you want to do more healing, or say if you're in raid and like for some reason you are dedicated to like really spot healing the tanks, which isn't really necessary anymore in a lot of raids, but there are some cases where, like, hey, we need to really keep the tanks alive here. That's where Mastery comes into play and can be really beneficial. So, and what Mastery does is it basically just makes it to where when you press certain healing spells, it does additional healing instantly to the person that you targeted with that spell. So they just get extra. Um, and I think that pretty much covers it for Monk. I don't think there's anything else to really go over. Just to recap real quick. Crit's your best healing stat, just flat out. Versatility is your next best healing stat because of the way it scales with a lot of things. And then you have haste, which is just the feel better stat. So you get that when you want your class to feel a little bit more smooth. Um, it doesn't have any like unique benefits or negatives to it. It's just that it's not the best at anything, but it overall just helps the class feel better. And then mastery is best for single target healing or small group healing, a lot where you're doing a lot of direct healing to people. So in M plus, if you feel like you need more healing, mastery is the way to go. But otherwise, crit, verse, all that stuff is best. And as far as damage goes, if you're like an M plus and you want to just maximize the amount of damage you can do, I would say like haste, verse, and haste crit are going to be your best options. So basically, all you do is just take a lot of haste in M plus, and then mix crit and verse, and pretty much stay as far away from mastery as possible if your goal is to do as much damage as possible, because mastery doesn't benefit your damage whatsoever. Yeah, that's it. So that covers everything. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, like button, share it with people, trying to spread the content and get things going as we get into this new raid tier. And again, be sure to check out my Patreon. All the links that are essential are kind of down in the description below. If you have any questions, let me know. But thank you again. Can't thank you enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a good day. See you later.